have Xavier Boix from MIT. Xavier Boix works as a research scientist at MIT and is a member of the Brain and Connected Science Department and the Singhar Lab for Developmental Research. He has received training both in machine learning and neuroscience as a postdoc at MIT in the Singhar Lab and Pedro's Lab, as well as the multidisciplinary NSF Center for Brains, Man, and Machines. He obtained a doctorate from ETH Zurich in computer vision and completed a postdoc at the National University of Singapore. So Xavier's talk will be live, and you can ask him questions after his talk. The floor is yours, Xavier.
Thanks a lot, Bing Chen. Do you hear me well?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Perfect. Let me share the screen. Do you guys see my screen?
Yeah, I can see your screen.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Okay. This is Xavier Boix. Thanks a lot for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here today to speak in this workshop. I am very thankful for the organizers who have invited me. I am humbled to be part of this incredible list of speakers that includes actually several of my research heroes. Today, I'm going to be talking about how to use neuroscience to address the problem of auto-distribution generalization. And in particular, I'm going to be focusing on auto-distribution generalization in objects in new orientations. Okay, so since the workshop is about auto-distribution generalization, I don't need to convince you guys about the importance of this topic. I only want to emphasize that auto-distribution generalization is of critical importance in applications when human lives are at stake. This is the case of self-driving cars, surveillance, medical imaging, and so on. So when machine vision makes a mistake in these cases, human life may be at risk, or at least there could be problems of social fairness in those mistakes, if those mistakes tend to appear in certain communities. So we cannot afford deploying machines that unexpectedly fail. And a related idea to these unexpected failures is also the idea of trustability. A system that we trust is a system that we understand the decision-making process. So we need OOD generalization and trustability to deploy machine learning in critical applications for society. And I personally believe that this has not been achieved because we lack some theoretical understanding on how to do this. Theories should serve to explain the systems so that we can trust them. And at the same time, theory should drive improvements of the generalization capabilities of those systems. Okay, and how do we develop such theories and such fundamental principles that would allow all this, right? So one approach is to use the scientific method. That's that type of approach is receiving more and more interest in the community. And what do I mean by the scientific method? I simply mean guessing falsifiable hypotheses and testing them. At the core of the scientific method, there is the point of falsification of the hypothesis. That is, the hypothesis cannot be ever proved right. There is always the possibility to be tested wrong. If we eventually find an experiment that shows that a hypothesis fails and is wrong, these are usually great news because this gives us the opportunity to develop a stronger hypothesis that explains all previous experiments and the new one. So in other words, and just to emphasize what I said, there is always the possibility that the new experiment proves an hypothesis wrong. That's by definition what is a scientific hypothesis. Note that the scientific approach is different from the mainstream approach in the community based on using mathematics and statistics to explain machine learning and to develop theories of machine learning, as math and statistics are based on tautology and not on the scientific method. The scientific approach has also been tremendously successful in many fields and led to great theories and applications in other fields. And I believe that the scientific method can do the same in machine learning and machine vision. Okay, so from different approaches we could take for developing scientific theories, we are taking a particular one, which is using the tools and the methodology that neuroscience has developed for studying the brain. But here, instead of applying to study the brain, those tools, we apply them to study machine vision. The reason why this approach is promising, we believe it's promising, is because neuroscience has developed intuitive theories to explain the brain that have been relatively successful to different degrees. Of course, there are many mysteries about the brain that are unsolved, But as a starting point, this can be a very fruitful methodology, as there is plenty of theories available and plenty of experiments that have been done to study the brain. We can just take them and apply them to study machine vision. So as a starting point, this is actually a low-hanging fruit. Of course, there is also some similarities between the brain and machine vision, and that actually these similarities makes actually this approach reasonable. Of course, there are also dissimilarities between the brain and machine vision, but at the same time, it has been shown that to a substantial degree, the neural activity in the brain and the neural activity in artificial neurons resemble each other. So it's a straightforward idea to bring experiments and theories that could be used to explain the biological system to explain an artificial system. And that's actually what we have been trying to do. And today, what I'm going to be showing you is some of our results we obtained using this approach. So as you can imagine, the type of results we are going to be showing is not going to be a big system that solve or improve auto-distribution generalization, but more about trying to figure out what are the principles in which we need to build those systems, right? The development of theories to build those systems. So before going into our results, let me explain more clearly what I mean by using neuroscience to understand machine vision. Let me give you some more intuition about what this means. So essentially, we focus on two main points for doing that, two main tools that are central in neuroscience. First is using controlled experiments. In the case of neuroscience or any science in general, when you do an experiment to test a hypothesis, it is needed to meticulously design the experiment to make sure there are no underlying factors that could interfere. So if you are studying object orientation, which is what I'm going to be presenting today, it is best to remove any potential confounders in the experiment and just leave aspects of object orientation. So for example, if you add data set, if in your data set you have backgrounds, you have color, you have textures, and so on, besides object orientation, could be that your neural network is using those other factors to achieve certain degrees of accuracy. So it might be best to remove all these other factors if you want to study object orientation. The second point that we borrow from neuroscience is an intuitive theory that has been at the core of neuroscience, and which in computer vision terms, you could put it in the following way. So neurons are feature detectors. That's a way to mention one of the core points of theoretical, some of the theories in neuroscience. There are actually works in interpretability in computer vision that use this idea to study how neural networks work, right? The idea that the essential building block of an artificial neural network is that neurons are feature detectors. For example, a neuron detecting legs of a dog or a face of a fish, etc. Then you might have properties like invariance to orientations, invariance to illuminations, or invariance to other nuisance factors on top of neurons are feature detectors. These invariances could help generalization, right? This idea of neurons tuned to an image feature and invariant to nuisance factors is central to neuroscience, and we will use it here to explain machine vision as well. Okay, let me give you a quick overview of what I will be presenting today. First, I will focus on a core mechanism to achieve recognizing novel objects in out-of-distribution orientations. We will show that orientation invariance can be learned in a set of objects and then disseminated to another different set of objects. After this, I will present a more complex scenario in which we'll have a second task for the system, which would be also recognizing the orientation of the object, not only its category. And this will help us determine what are the principles to build systems for multitask in a multitask scenario with auto-distribution generalization required. Okay, and I'm just speaking on behalf of the team that I'm collaborating at MIT. It is a privilege, and I'm extremely grateful to collaborate with talented students, postdocs, and other researchers who are not only brilliant at the technical and the scientific level, but also the human level. I also want to thank the Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines, and also Fujitsu Research for their generous support and encouragement. In the bottom row here, I also want to thank the new team members that just recently joined, and we are very excited to have them in the team. Okay, let's go to the matter. The first topic is the core mechanism for OOD generalization. You can find a preprint online. And if you have any questions or anything, please feel free to send me an email. I will be more than happy to explain you more details. Okay, so as I said, this is going to be about trying to figure out what could be one of the core principles for OOD generalization in novel orientations. Before going into this, please take a look to the following image, and let's see if you can figure out the following question. Can you tell me which of these three caps is the one on top? Right? And I guess all of you very rapidly could deduce that the answer is A, right? And probably you have done this, maybe looking at the handle, it's kind of roundish, right? And this one is also roundish, while this one's not. The color of all of them is more or less the same. Maybe this one is a bit different, right? But you could quickly figure this out. And what is maybe interesting here is that this is the first time that you see this cap, but you haven't had much problem to actually associate it with the correct one. So what principles could have facilitated recognizing this new object in a new orientation, right? And one approach that these days is very trendy is to use a lot of training examples, collect as much training data as possible, right? And use as much compute as possible, and then hope the generalization somehow emerges, generalization out of distribution somehow emerges. So it's not clear that this approach can succeed in addressing the full compositional space of out of distribution objects, attributes, and a scene, as this space is exponentially large, right? Even if big data could eventually solve it, right, there is also the question of how to make it more efficient. So the question of how to solve this task efficiently is actually of crucial importance. Like a second approach that could come to our mind, I'm just simplifying the different approaches, but just to give a big overview to go to the main matter, is that the second approach could be having some sort of internal explicit 3D model that then you can somehow compare with the input image, some sort of inverse graphics, right? This is an interesting approach, and actually some of the organizers, Alan and Adam, who are organizing this workshop, have in the previous years have introduced some key developments towards the approach. An interesting open question is if you have a new object, how do you derive this 3D model from the data, right? So there are remaining open questions similarly to the approach of using big data. Okay, so following up on these open questions, on these two main research areas I just mentioned, I would like to point out the following observation based on human vision, right? It's quite a straightforward observation. It is very easy for us as humans to take one cap with our hands and rotate it and see it from many viewpoints, right? So the type of training examples that as we humans have, it's more like having certain sets of objects seen in many different orientations, while others, the new objects, are only seen in very few, right? So what we are considering here is the following: learning some mechanism of orientation invariance from a limited set of objects seen from many viewpoints, such that those mechanisms can be transferred to new objects. In other words, dissemination of orientation invariance across object categories. This could be the core mechanism for OOD generalization, right? This seems a fundamental principle which any system for OOD generalization in novel orientations could use. Understanding this mechanism could help us making system more data efficient and effectively learn 3D representations of new objects, right? So I'm not saying that with this we are opening a new third approach, but I'm just saying that this observation could be at the core of any of the previous systems on any of the ongoing research. Okay, so the experiments I'm going to be presenting here are actually derived from classical neuroscience, and particularly by papers by Nikos Logothetis and Tommy Boix. So we are just here reproducing experiments done in monkeys, but in this case done in artificial neural networks. The cool thing of doing this in neural networks is that unlike monkeys, neural networks don't get tired, and so far they are not sentient. So we can happily experiment and do a lot more experimentation than in biological systems. What you see in the figure is the experimental paradigm I'm going to be using. In every column, you see a different instance of an airplane, and in every row, a different orientation. The so-called full scene instances are the objects that are seen from absolutely every viewpoint, right? Like the example I put before of a cap that you can rotate it, right, and see it from everywhere. While the partially seen instances are only seen in a few viewpoints, right? The ones that you would like to recognize with very few training examples. We use all the instance viewpoint combinations in purple to generate the training set and train a neural network. The interesting thing to observe is when and how the network recognizes the objects in the orange area, right? The out-of-distribution orientations. To achieve this, the deep neural network needs to disseminate invariants from the fully seen instances to the partially seen instances, right? So it needs to learn invariants from here and then somehow translate it to these new object instances. Yeah, and maybe just mention here that it's not entirely clear that that's possible, and if it's possible, how the neural network achieves it, right? The objects I'm showing here are airplanes from the ShapeNet dataset. And as I said before, here there is only the shape. We don't include textures or background and so on, such that we make sure that we are studying and we are analyzing the capabilities of the neural network to generalize to new orientations. Okay, so we have done these experiments, and of course, I don't have time to explain all the details, but we made efforts to tune hyperparameters, to test many different architectures, and so on, to make sure that the conclusions I'm going to be reporting are as general as possible and are reproducible across conditions. So first of all, note that we tried a varying number of fully seen instances. That's what you see in the x-axis, right? That we change from 10 to 40. So we have a total of 50 object instances, and we always test on the same 10 for all cases, such that we can compare training with different number of fully seen instances. It is important to highlight that the amount of data remains constant for all experiments, no matter how many instances are fully seen. The amount of data is determined such that the in-distribution and out-of-distribution accuracy are saturated, right? So we made sure that we have as much data as possible to have the maximum accuracy in all the cases, right? So that's not a problem of data. What we are going to be discussing here is more about what happens when you just have all the possible amount of data, what things you can tweak here. In the plot, you can see in the dice lines, which are on top, the in-distribution accuracy. And you can see that it's very close to 100%, right? So in distribution, that seems very easy, as I guess everyone expected. And we observe this for almost all experts. It's actually no challenge if you test in distribution in this case. But when you go out to distribution, interesting things start to happen. You have here 3 solid lines, which are the results of auto-distribution. And each of these lines represent different training conditions. One is training from scratch. This is the one in the middle. The line on the top is with the data augmentation. In this case, we have added rotations. In this case, of course, 2D rotations, some blur and noise, the standard data augmentation pipeline. And this achieves better accuracy, of course, because it includes the rotation, so some sort of boost of accuracy would be expected. And pre-training in this case is in ImageNet and harms the accuracy, mostly because ImageNet might contain some biases in terms of orientations, and also mostly because ImageNet is real images and these are synthetic and might not be transferring well. Right? The most interesting thing here to see is that the accuracy out of distribution increases as the number of fully seen instances increases. So this is interesting because it shows that neural networks can disseminate orientation invariants across categories in certain conditions, not always, namely when a sufficiently large number of categories are seen from many viewpoints, right? So having a rich training set seems to be key for generalization out of distribution. And it seems here that the core mechanism for out of distribution generalization that we were mentioning emerges in the system as we increase the number of fully seen instances. So I'm not going to extend here because I don't have a lot of time, but you can represent the different orientations using 3 angles, right? And then you can represent in a cube with all the possible orientations, and then you can take slices in these angles and make this type of plots. And what I'm showing here is different examples of experiments we have done and what we are depicting here. These are the orientations that are seen for the objects that are just partially seen in some orientations. And we repeated this in different ways with different types of objects, airplanes, cars, the Sheffer-Metzler objects, which these are really interesting because they are based only with local features that are cubes. And what matters here is the full 3D structure compared to airplanes and cars, which have more local features, right? So the Sheffer-Metzler objects would be expected to be more challenging than those ones. And we actually ran the same experiment, as I showed you before, in all these conditions in different objects. You have it For each row, the different objects, and for each column, you have different conditions in which the objects are seen during training, the ones that are partially seen. And you essentially get the same conclusions everywhere. Note that the accuracy always tends to be very low, right? Around 20, maximum 50%. And there is always this tendency, in most cases, that the accuracy increases as the number of fully seen instances increases. Again, this is auto-distribution accuracy, and that type of accuracy can only be achieved if there is dissemination of orientation invariance across objects. Okay, one cool thing that we can do in this experimental setup is to study the accuracy per orientation, right? For each cube for each cubelet in the cube I showed you before of orientations, we can print the accuracy and study if there are any patterns. In red, it is indicated the base orientation seen for partially seen objects, and in orange for the out-of-distribution orientations. So instead of analyzing the average accuracy, I just showed you in the previous plots, which is a standard procedure in the literature, right? So we report average accuracy across all the tests. We here now are going to zoom in and we are going to analyze accuracy for each different orientation and see if there are any patterns. So the first pattern we observe is something I already mentioned. We have seen that the more fully seen instances of objects that are in the training set, then the final accuracy out of distribution increases, right? Yet, interestingly, this only happens for a subset of orientations. And what we have done here is we examine all the different experiments, we examine all these heat maps, and we try to find patterns to explain how the neural network behaves, because those patterns seem to be very well structured, seem to be very clear across patterns. And essentially, we observe this qualitative, we could see qualitatively some trends, but in order to make sure that we were capturing the full behavior of the network, we actually evaluated this quantitatively. So we translated our qualitative observations into a model that can be evaluated quantitatively. So, and the model has essentially three components. It's not important what are those three components. I just want to give the idea here that you can actually zoom in into your testing errors and you can actually find very strong patterns and characterize it here. In this case, for this data set and these experiments, we have found these three components, but in another data set, in other scenarios, you might find other components. Like if you start adding textures, backgrounds, illuminations, maybe for sure more components are going to be added and maybe much more complex than the ones I'm going to show here. So the first component of the model says that the neural network generalized when the angle of the tested airplanes or the tested object is very similar to the angles of the objects that have been included in the training set, right? So I guess that's expected, right? The second term is more surprising and is based on the observation that neural networks are capable of generalizing into out of distribution orientations that are 2D rotations, that is in-plane rotations of examples in the training set. This capability is not perfect, as we have seen, and only emerging in specific cases, as we will show, but is very prominent. So it seems that neural networks can only learn to do these 2D rotations out of distribution. Finally, the third component that we derive from our qualitative analysis is that neural networks sometimes generalize to images that have the same or similar silhouette as an image in the training set. Thus, networks may use the silhouette to recognize those objects. And this only happens for some cases, especially objects that don't have internal features, that mostly with the silhouette, you can end up deriving the entire object instance. Okay, and essentially what we do here, the procedure is we implemented this model, which as you can imagine, is just based on very simple geometry equations based on geometry. And the model just tells us the accuracy for each orientation. And then we compare the accuracy given by the model with the accuracy, the real accuracy of the network, and we compare it with the Pearson correlation. And then if this Pearson correlation is very high, it means that the model is very predictive, and we have understood and we have captured the full behavior of the network. So given I have limited time, I will just you to focus on the purple line, which is the full model. Then you can decompose it into different components and you may see interesting patterns. But for now, just focus on the full model. And you can see that the accuracy of the model is really high. It's more than 0.75. That's a very high Pearson correlation, indicating that these three components I just mentioned capture close to almost all the behavior of the network. Interestingly, if you just take random uniform, which means that you assume or you are considering the hypothesis that neural networks out of distribution have no pattern, like the accuracy is random across orientation, and the Pearson correlation is close to zero, meaning that that's clearly not what the neural network is behaving. you repeat the same for all the experiments, you get always very high Pearson correlation between the model and the behavior, which means that our model, it captures the full thing. So these are the main takeaways of this first batch of research I wanted to show you. So I hope you guys are now a bit more convinced that this dissemination of orientation invariance across objects could be a core principle for out-of-distribution generalization. And we hope that the observations we have made help characterizing the behavior of neural networks, studying the biases, and hopefully also the, inspiring methods that could further improve the capabilities. And the second part of the talk, I just have 5 more minutes. It will be very quick overview, is adding an additional component to here, which is now the network not only needs to predict the category, but needs to predict the viewpoint. And here there is a classic question about what type of architecture you would like to use, right? Fully together, like multitask literature say that when the 2 tasks are have some relationship, may be better to put it together to improve the accuracy, or fully separately, or some sort of mix, right? And here we have in this scenario, which is out of distribution. So in this case, only a subset of the combinations of category viewpoints are seen during training, and then we test 2 novel ones, right? It's out of distribution, multitask training. And we created some data sets with computer graphics, again, in order to make sure we are testing the right thing. Here we added a bit more challenging, but in the paper, we also include more control scenarios to make sure, again, that the networks are not using any shortcuts. Our conclusions are not just the outcome of some trick or some shortcut that is in the data set. Okay, let's have a look to the results. Again, in the x-axis, we have the data diversity, right? How many combinations of category viewpoint have been included in the training set. And again, once more, we made sure that the amount of training data is not a factor here. We just saturate the accuracies with as much data as needed for the system. And in the dice lines, you see the in-distribution accuracy, and you see it's relatively high in this case for the bias scarce data set that we introduced. And you see here 2 lines, one in red, one in blue. The red is actually when you share the 2 tasks in the same network, and in blue when you don't share it. And as you see, and as you expected from the literature of multitask, it's a bit better shared, right? Note that this axis goes from 0 to 100, right? So this might look small, but here you have at least 2-3% accuracy, right? Which is more or less what usually multitask works report, right? In case that you have a lot of data, you may have still with shared architectures a little bit of boost, 2-3%. When we went to out of distribution generalization, we got a big surprise because the gap is really, really big. In this case, it's 20%, and for the others, I think we tested in this paper 6 other data set, it went up even sometimes 80% difference between the separate architecture and the shared architecture. So actually the separate architecture is much better than the shared architecture. And if you run the experiment in which now you have a little bit of network shared across the 2 tasks, actually you can see how it decreases progressively as you share more and more between the 2 tasks, right? And we want to explain this in terms of neural activity. I will need to explain this very superficially, but you can actually analyze the neurons, how they develop invariances to the different nuisance factors. And what you observe is that for the separate architecture, because this is already broken into 2, the neurons actually are specialized more easily to their respective task and become invariant to the other tasks because they are not forced to keep information about the 2 tasks. Well, this neural network cannot do it. When you share it, somehow the neurons need to learn to specialize to the 2 tasks. And because there is bias, the neurons get confused and capture the shortcuts more easily than if you just force it and separate the 2 tasks such that you avoid the biases. So something that we have done we try to do it very meticulously is to measure those invariances and selectivities, these ideas I'm just telling you now, quantitatively, and see how this predicts the behavior of the network, the accuracy of the network. So we want to find some mechanism in the neurons that can explain the out-of-distribution generalization abilities of the networks. And essentially, we just went to the neuroscience literature, we just look at how people measure those things in biological neurons, and we just adapted it to artificial neural networks. And what you see here is the degree of for the neurons that are in this plot over here, for the neurons that are tuned to category, the degree of invariance to pose. And this is the other way around. for the neuron selective or the specialized to pose, the degree of invariance to category. And as you can see, when you separate the network, this is the blue plot, the scores are much higher, and it goes down, it degrades as you share more part of the network. So going again around this idea that putting things together in the same network, it actually doesn't help at all in auto-distribution scenario when you have this type of bias we're analyzing. And just finally, to close, if you take, in this plot, what I'm showing here is just every dot here corresponds to different data set with a different network, a different method to improve auto-distribution accuracy to new viewpoints and orientations. And in the y-axis, you have the invariance score. So this is, again, one score that we measure with these metrics I just mentioned from the neuroscience literature. And what you see when you put this into one plot is that there is a clear relationship between invariance and out-of-distribution accuracy, indicating and suggesting that the underlying neural mechanisms that allow for out-of-distribution generalization are related to invariance and the individual neural level, right? So essentially the takeaways of this second part of the talk is that, well, the first takeaway is the first across the entire talk, is that more data diversity, not more data, but more data diversity implies better generalizations to unseen combinations of orientations and viewpoints. Also, I have shown that separate architectures are much, much better than shared architectures in out-of-distribution combinations of viewpoints and orientations. And finally, just give you a brief overview that the results can be explained through neural specialization, that is selectivity and invariance. And yeah, just I would like to thank once more to all my colleagues, and also thank to you for your attention. And if you have any questions, I will be happy to take them, or feel free to send me any email at any point if you are interested in this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Xavier. That's an excellent talk. Is there any questions from the audience? Okay. Hi, Zhao, do you have a question?
Yeah. Hi, Xavier. Thanks for your interesting talk. And I have a question about the out-of-distribution scenario. Could you give more insights about why this separated architecture would perform better than the shared architecture?
Yes. Let me go back here. So first of all, note the bias that we have here. You guys see my screen, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so in this case, we have this category and viewpoint, right? And we are targeting to predict what is the category and the viewpoint, right? And the bias somehow it mixes the two things together, right? So some categories are only seen in some viewpoints. So some features that might appear in some viewpoints might be a shortcut to the category and vice versa, right? So these two tasks are somehow mixed together in terms of bias. Right. So when you put them separate, so you are actually allowing. Well, let me explain from another point of view. When you put them together in the same network, what happens is that you're forcing the same neural network architecture to solve the two tasks, right? So in a way, you are encouraging the network to use the shortcuts, right? Because at the same time, you are asking, hey, tell me the combination of category pose using the same network, right? So and the combination is where the shortcuts are, where the bias is. While when you put it separately, the network that just the category can actually get rid of the pose, can say, okay, now I just want the category. I don't need to take into account things about the pose. So it can actually get rid of it. I can become invariant to it. Well, here you are not allowing to that. You're preventing this to happen, right? Because you are actually in this network, you are asking for the pose, right? So, and that allows for the, for picking up the shortcuts. Yeah.
Okay.
It's yeah. Is it clear? Or
yeah. Do you think our human also follow this pattern when we think about the question?
That's a great question because I mean, let me we thought about this because in the brain we have these two, what is called the ventral and dorsal stream, and one is for the category and the other is more about the spatial understanding. So the brain seems to have a structure in which you have these two things also separately. Of course, I wouldn't like to claim that we found the reason computationally with our experiments to explain the brain, but it seems an interesting coincidence that maybe it's not really a coincidence, right? Oh, I see a question about the added capacity of the network. we did that experiment. We considered that, and we also tested networks which are, let's say, because this network over here has the double of the neurons of here, right?
Mm-hmm.
We also tested with wider networks here, and that's what you see in dice lines. You don't get any improvement by using wider networks. So that's that question. We actually looked at it.
Thanks, I see.
Thank you.
Thanks, Xavier. Thanks for the question. Is there any other questions from the audience? Okay. I have a question for you, Xavier. So it's more of a general question. So when you consider the current approach to testing neural networks, do you think we are testing the neural networks correctly, or do you think there are better ways to test the neural networks?
That's I really like this question. Thanks a lot. That's a question we thought a lot. As you can see in all the experiments, our datasets look maybe simple from a point of view of computer vision. But what we are aiming always is to isolate, to make sure that what we are testing is actually true generalization. We are not having in the data set something that the network can use as a shortcut, right? Of course, in our case, we might also have shortcuts, so I cannot be 100% sure. And you see this also in neuroscience happening a lot. Someone might say, look, I ran this experiment with this data set in monkeys, so this hypothesis might be true, this hypothesis might be false. But later people found, oh, that could have been because in your data set, you had this here hidden that you didn't realize, right? So this business of introducing a data set and looking into it and what are the underlying factors is actually, in neuroscience, it happens a lot. So I worry that in computer vision, we have a lot about this. And it clearly, out of distribution, it comes from that, right? Like data, people has claimed victory from ImageNet or some data set like this, and it was more like there are a lot of shortcuts in those data sets that the network uses. So in out of distribution testing, we should make sure the same. We should make sure that we don't have new shortcuts there, right?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your talk. If there's no more questions, well, we will go to the next talk.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Xavier. Thank you for the excellent talk. Okay.